Welcome, Josie. I'm really excited to have this conversation today.
Hey, I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, I think this is a topic of really great interest to me. Um, and really, what I'd love to do is kind of just jump right in to ask you about your perspective on just like what does it mean to really prioritize the customer experience and to understand the journey.
Yeah. And it's an interesting question. And I think really at a very basic level, before we talk about like what it looks like to do it and how you do it, it's just like, why is it worth doing? Like, why is it worth prioritizing that customer experience? And I think that it comes down to two big things. And one of them is about product, and one of them is about the way that you think about your business. And I think prioritizing customer experience sort of starts with acknowledging that your users and your customers know more about your product than you do. And that's hard to believe, right? Because we understand like this is the back end, this is technically how things work, this is our use cases, and these are the flows we want people to go through. But there's nobody who knows your product like the people who use it without any of that context, right? Or who use it without the benefit of understanding your aspirations of what you want your product to be. And so really optimizing that customer experience and prioritizing that experience is about saying that the real, authoritative speakers on our product are our users. And so customer experience is about the act of listening and genuinely hearing feedback from those people about what it's like to be a user of your product, right? Like that's really at the heart of customer experience is that listening and that response to what customers say about what it feels like and like what it looks like to be a user of your product. And I think if that feels a little soft, and maybe it is a little bit, then I think the other reality is just like new customer acquisition is great. It's really important. Every business needs it. But the real indicator of health, I would say, and one of the biggest indicators of health in a business is like how well do you retain and make really happy and potentially expand the customers that you already have? How do you build for that user base that's growing with you as your product grows? And again, I think customer experience is about looking at that cohort of people and saying, you are so critical to our understanding of where we are now and where we need to go. And that's where we're going to start from. Right. So like and maybe that's basic, like maybe it's fundamental and everybody is like, yes, obviously. But I think it's important to talk about those things and to say like, that's really what drives the heart of customer experience. And I think, companies who prioritize CX most effectively are the ones, again, that like ask for and listen with genuine interest to customers as they talk about and experience your product in real time.
Yeah. So actually, I think that might be a great jumping off point to cover so how do you do that? I mean, once you really
Right.
buy into, the value of doing it, especially kind of telling that story with both analytics and, how you might do that with both kind of the quantitative and the qualitative information.
Yeah.
Analytics and then kind of those insights that are more like soft, as you just said.
Yeah. Well, you said like one of the word value was something that you said. And I really think like that is the heart of it, right? Like how do you help customers achieve value, see value? But another part of that comes down to how do you help customers articulate what value would look like for them? I think it becomes really difficult to say that you're seeing value or you're not seeing value if you don't understand like what is that end goal. And maybe it's a little meta, but if we say we want to help our customers articulate how they see value, first you have to articulate how you as a business would see value and customer experience, right? So, and there are some things that I think are traditional or standard. You would look at potentially an NPS, you would look at potentially expansions or retention numbers, and those are all critical. But I think starting to think a little more about, okay, those are long tail effects of whether a customer is happy or unhappy. But how do we really see whether customers find value in the product? And I think about things like, how long does it take the average customer to complete key workflows in your tool, right? Like, and both in length of time, in time they spend in the tool, in time they spend from the time they sign up to the time that they see this end result. These are things that, how quickly can someone really start to understand and adopt your product in a way that's meaningful for them? I really think that one of these key tenets of customer experience is investing really, really heavily in those first 30 to 60 days of the customer experience. Like, that early adoption is one of the strongest indicators of long-term success. So if you make it really easy to say, this is how to get started, this is how to start to see value, this is how to accomplish those key things that customers need to accomplish in your product, like that is a backbone, right? And the challenge for a business is in understanding, what are those things we want customers to accomplish, right? Like, and get more specific than just, we want them to renew. Like, of course you do, everybody does. But what are the things that you really want a customer to do in your product that would tell you that they're successful? And then backing out from that and saying, how do you measure it? You mentioned like qualitative, quantitative. I think that quantitative or, analytical data really tells you what's happening. It helps you see trends, right? Like, are you going up and to the right, or are you going down? And then qualitative data really tells you why. FullStory has, we have these watchwords internally that we anchor around: empathy, clarity, and bionics. And they sort of dictate everything we do in the customer experience organization. But I think, to borrow from those watchwords, like, quantitative is about the bionics, right? It's about the things that you can measure with a specific number and a trend line that goes up, trend line that goes down. And then qualitative is about the empathy. It's about, what does it really, again, look like or feel like to have an experience in your product? And you need both to have that clarity around how you solve for pain points and how you drive product innovation.
Yeah, I think, what really resonated for me, well, there are two things actually that you were just talking about that really resonated for me. I think the first one was, I often see that the greatest opportunity is when the business has one set of assumed values that they want the customer to be achieving, and you use qualitative information to find out actually they want something else. And that expectation gap ends up being one of the areas that you can focus optimization on. Because really,
I think,
yeah.
No, and I think you bring up such a good point, which is that it is so essential, one, that you align at an executive level and align with your business stakeholders to say, like, what are we all driving towards together, right? Because I think if we all have different ideas about, this is how we would know that customer experience is positive, this is how we know we're seeing returns, like, really unifying around those numbers is one thing. And then I think the other thing that you sort of brought up is, we might have perceptions of customer value that customers don't agree with. Like, we might have things that we're tracking that we say, like, this is really valuable. If a customer could do this, they'd be incredibly successful. And the customers do that, and it's not the top priority, right? Like, they find value. And again, this comes back to that belief that the customer is the authority about what's valuable about your product, right? And sometimes I think it makes sense. Like, again, this is that listening and understanding and adapting of saying, customers see value in ways that we might not have anticipated because they know their business in a way that we don't. And therefore we pivot, right? Like, therefore we say, like, okay, we have heard and received the feedback that this specific thing is a lot more valuable than we thought. So we move towards driving towards that behavior, right? Like, we're willing to let go of certain, either features or funnels or things that we really believed in internally, in favor of following the signal of the customer towards really what provides value to them.
Yeah. Yeah. So to that point, we actually have a related question that came up in chat. And it's around, really, I'm going to reframe it just a little bit to make it, I think, a little bit easier to understand, but it is like, how do you get internal stakeholders around the idea of when you make that adjustment, right? Like, let's say you've learned something that's really valuable about that expectation gap. Is it better to think about it as we're going to kind of fit that into the regular sprint flow that we have? Let's say you've got like a quarter release, right? Or is it better to take an ad hoc approach? Like, what are the sorts of things that you should be thinking about as you're deciding what the best way is to address those concerns?
It's a good question. And I think, I'm a big believer in data-driven decision making, even within customer experience, which is one of those places, I think, parts of the business that's still catching up to that way of thinking. And I think it's a lot easier in some other parts of an organization to say, these are the numbers that we anchor on, these are the numbers we look at. But I think using data-driven stats to tell a story about your customer's experience, and then supporting that with the qualitative information, with those quotes that you can put up in a meeting that are really hard to read as a customer experience person, as a product person, that say like, this is difficult to use, I don't see value. Like, I've seen those slides in my life. And I remember it very clearly. But letting your customer tell their story is important, So I think that there's a couple of different things. There's the first piece, which is about how do you make the argument? And then the second piece, which is about how you execute on it, right? Like, just practically speaking, what do you recommend? And I think in terms of how you make the argument, it's that data, right? Like, it has to come back to that data. Do you have, for example, customers who hit specific errors in your product and then don't go on to complete certain actions? I think those are things where it's like, that error is costing you the success of a significant portion of your users. Now, underneath all of that is the tooling that it takes to get that type of information. And I do think investing in like data and the tech stack for your customer experience org and your product org is critical, right? Like, it's essential, because otherwise you're only ever going to be able to guess. And guesses, again, can really only take you so far before you have to validate with real customer usage. But I think one is like, get that data, understand, presenting both the trends and the impact, and also those like hard-hitting qualitative pieces of feedback, whether it's somebody like a user testing session, someone saying like, this is really hard to use, or it with FullStory, and other session replay tools, like being able to actually just watch somebody experience something difficult in real time. And then the other side is like, how do you execute on the solution? And I think finding that balance between, there's no reason to sit on something that would improve the customer's experience. Like, if you can build it and you can ship it, like, do it, like, and maybe that maybe applies a little more to companies that have sort of an agile framework and can move quickly. But think too, sometimes I think we can get caught up in saying like, oh, I understand now that this area of the product would be improved if we would just introduce these new buttons or overhaul this user interface. So we're going to do it and we're going to ship it. But we don't tell anybody that it's going to happen. And we don't enable our customer facing teams on how to talk about that change. We don't let our marketers know or our sellers know that it's going to happen. And I think that's actually a situation where you've shipped something that's great for a customer, but actually made it really hard to articulate that value and undercut yourself a little bit, right? Because you haven't armed your teams to say like, or even backing up from that, your teams haven't looked at and validated that solution and said like, yes, I get it. This sounds like the types of things I hear from customers, or this looks like what I would have expected. That's important. And so I think in some ways that question about how you deploy it or how you plan it comes down to, one, like, what is the size of your company? What are your structures? What works for you? But also, what types of things might you need to do beyond just building and deploying a solution that would really solve for the problem?
Yeah, I think all of those points are really important. Is that as you were talking, I was thinking about some, experiences that I've had where all of those things have happened, right? Where we've run across something doing qualitative testing with users, and it's been like that one sticking point, that one pain point that is like that literal like $1 million problem, usability problem.
Yeah.
And the only way that we ran across it was actually doing usability testing. Like we had surveys, running, we had analytics running, and just had a really hard time finding it. And just finding that and then picking up the phone and calling and saying, oh my gosh, we found it. And here's the example, and getting on the phone with the engineers. And, it wasn't one of these things. Actually, the real pain point was there was an error. And about a third of transactions were just blocked. Like you just could not get through this error screen. And that's, I think one of the arguments for just like, that's something that you don't necessarily have to have a communications plan, right? To be able to get people to buy into the value of that, right? It really is, you're just fixing a problem. So, taking that ad hoc approach really fits there. But in other cases, it's not as relevant.
Right. Like fit the solution to the problem. Right. And it's always about that balance of all things considered. And this is what customer experience comes back to, but like all things considered, what is the right thing to do for the customer, and how do you give them the best possible outcome? And I do think that can vary a little bit based off of the size of the change that you're proposing to make or the effort involved and how much it would disrupt your user's experience beyond what you just said, which is like, we're going to fix an error that's preventing people from doing things. And that's not really something that I would say like, oh, we should enable people to understand that they're not going to experience errors anymore. Like that's a baseline expectation.
Yeah, agreed. So shifting gears just a little bit.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts around how you can make an experience compelling? I think, compelling means a lot of different things, right? But what are the things that you can do to really make sure that people understand that experience to be compelling?
Yeah. And I think that it's about two parts, right? Like one, it's about their experience in the product, like the organic experience of using a tool. And it's also about their interaction with you and your brand, I'll say. And maybe to start with that, because really the way that someone engages with any touch point in your business, consider the fact that, or I guess think about, a great experience that you've had with a brand. Now, you might have had any number of touch points with that brand, and it may have been a bunch of different people, right? In a bunch of different functions, but all of that for you falls under the umbrella of that singular brand, right? Like every interaction that you have contributes positively or negatively to how you feel about UserTesting or FullStory or anything else. And so I think one thing that's essential for brands is to make sure that internally within your business, you are unifying your view of the customer. So making sure, and when you talk about especially building out customer experience, like your folks internally, whether it's your support folks, your renewals folks, or your, customer success folks, or anything else, your sales folks, marketing, all need to be speaking the same language to the customer, right? And that means like making sure that conversation is consistent across every touch point. So is everybody in the know about what you as a user have contacted a customer, a company to talk about? Do they know about what you've experienced up until now? Do they know about what your onboarding experience was like, or the last 5 support tickets that you've logged, or anything else? Like some of this is sort of specific to how your business is structured, but I think broadly, good experiences are human in nature, right? So everything you do in your product has to be supported by like great touch points with your people. And so you need to enable your people to have those touch points appropriately, right? Like you need the right internal processes that give you that holistic view of a customer.
Yeah. I was really just thinking about the idea of, like dashboards, like what goes on that dashboard. And just, obviously there's the trend lines and just the hard metrics and the measures and those signals that you're keeping an eye on that you've been talking about, like support requests. And there's also those like softer, so here are some examples of when it's not gone well, or where it has gone well. Let's make more of these. I always think of the Chip Heath like bright spots concept. Yeah. More of those.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's worth thinking about, like when we talk about a great experience in the product, right? And how you build that and how you track that. Like going back to this idea of value and this idea of validating your value propositions, like if you could sit down and just write down, here are the 5 things that I posit that customers get the most value of out of my service or my product or my tool. Just the 5. Start there. If we're starting at the very beginning, like start there. What is your hypothesis about how customers see value and really what they get out of using your product? And then, this is key, don't just assume that that's accurate, right? Like then go have the conversations, right? Ask the questions, whether you're surfacing that one-on-one or you start to surface it in-app, if you're serving up in-app things, if you're tracking, like obviously on the back end, you support that by tracking data around what are the most used areas of your products. Like where do people engage the most? Where do they get hung up the most? Where do they drop off the most? I think those are all things that you can look at that are specific numbers and data, but you support them with those conversations, right? Like you support them by validating your assumptions. And then again, when the customer tells you something, maybe they validate some stuff, they challenge some other stuff, and then you can say, all right, what they've challenged, does the data support that? And if it doesn't, do we need to keep looking? Do we need to keep talking? Do we need to widen our scope? Or have we talked to a group of people that's in the same cohort? Have we not looked outside and said, like, let's talk to people outside of this specific role or this specific industry or this specific use case? Like making sure that you have a really diverse sort of group to choose from in that way. But then using, again, that qualitative feedback to sort of guide you in validating it with quantitative data, and then seeing where do they not match up, like in those points where they don't match up, where the data tells you one thing and the people tell you something else, that's the most interesting part, right? Like those are the parts where the business can spend time really solving for those problems.
Yeah. And, it's interesting that you bring that up, because I've always thought about, people often ask the question, should I start with those analytics first, or should I start with the qualitative piece first? And it actually, I think both ways work, right? Because in the end, you're still going to have to get to both sides of that story, right? And sometimes you find that signal in the hard quantitative data first, and sometimes you find it in that soft qualitative data first. And that just kind of guides you as you're really trying to problem solve.
Right. It might be, maybe we're just both scrappy, but like use what you've got. Like if you have, I will say, if you have the quantitative data, I think it makes it a little bit easier because the directional trends show up a little faster, right? Like your eye is always going to get drawn to like the number that doesn't look quite right, or that graph that's just going down. So I think that if you have the data and you can start there, of course, start there, but don't get caught up in this, like, well, we've got to have all these tools and we've got to have all this analytics and I got to figure out how to pull all this from the back end. Like if what you have is your customers, great. That again, you have the final authority on your product in your customers. And so go start having conversations, right? Or find scalable ways to get feedback from your customers about that experience. But, starting somewhere is better, I think, than saying like, well, we don't have what we need and not starting at all. I think you always have what you need. If you have access to a customer, or if you have access to the data about how people use your platform, you've got at least the beginnings of what you need, And the nice thing is we've talked about, you have this data and you can pull it. You have this data, you can pull it. You build the case sometimes for having access to that type of thing as you uncover these insights and you create better customer experiences, and customers validate that, right? They come back to you and say like, this has made a huge difference in us. This has helped us see value. This has made us want to renew, these things that you've done. And broadly, like this comes back to the personal touch, like that customers feel listened to, right? Like they tell you what works and what doesn't work, and they see you as a company respond to that, right? They see you build in a way that validates the idea that like you are intentionally listening and responding to that feedback.
Yeah. So, we've got a couple minutes left, but what I wanted to do was give you an opportunity to essentially reflect on what we've said so far. And if there's something that you haven't said, really about where you would start to track and optimize the experience, what are some of the takeaways that you'd want people to have?
Yeah, sure. Closing arguments. Yeah, I think that if there's anything I would want folks to walk away with, it's the belief that like this is worth doing, and that taking the time to really thoughtfully develop and execute on a data-driven customer experience reaps exponential benefits for your business and your customers, and I would want them to know that like you don't need, if you have great platforms and great tooling to get you started, perfect. And if you don't, that's okay too. Start with understanding what are those arguments that you personally have about how customers would find value, and center and really circle around that idea of value. What does it mean to see value? One, what is your hypothesis? Two, does your hypothesis align with an executive hypothesis, right? Like, can we agree on an executive level about what are these things that would indicate value from a customer? And stay away from just retention or expansion, right? Like, those are good. Look at those. But think about things that you can see and observe in your product or your service that tell you in real time, and not as a lagging indicator, that a customer is being successful, or is finding success and finding value. So develop your hypothesis, validate that hypothesis on an executive level, get buy-in that these are really the things we're looking for, and then go validate them either with data that you have on the back end, or by having those conversations and by having that qualitative sort of analysis. So validate it internally, validate it with customers, and then iterate. And if you skip iterating, you've lost the plot a little bit. Like, remember overall that like it is okay to change your opinion with presented with new information. And the beautiful thing about data is it's not going to lie to you, right? It's going to give you new information all the time. That information might challenge you. That's a good thing, right? Your customers might challenge you. That's even better. You respond to those things, right? You integrate, you adapt to your data, you respond to what the data tells you, you validate it with your customers, and then you take that back to your executives and you say, this is what we're seeing. This is how we prioritize what we do next, whether it's making changes to those human touch points that I talked about, whether it's making updates to the products like we talked about, and how you do that. And then you go do, and then you see what happens, right? Like, and again, the value of data is it will continue to change as you change things. You pull different levers, you see what works, you see what doesn't, and you do it all just believing that like that customer is at the heart of that experience, and how they feel about it is the most important thing.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a great sentiment to kind of close out the conversation with. And I thank you so much for your time today. You had a lot of really interesting points to share that I think people will be able to take away and leverage in their work.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to everybody who joined. I would love to hear from you guys, to hear your thoughts, to hear your rebuttals, just to hear different perspectives on customer experience. But it's just been a pleasure to be here and to chat with you, Lija.
Yeah, well, as you just kind of said, we're both very open to answering questions. So if you haven't had a chance to submit a comment or a question, please do that. We will answer those.